Where you left us off?
I think so. I think I remembered. All right. Good morning, everybody. It's so good to see you all here. Welcome. I'm glad you could make it. I had a couple of, before we get started, there was just a couple of things from last week, because you guys asked great questions. And I was thinking about the answers I gave, and I think some of my answers were, So, so I wanted to just kind of clarify. So this was the slide I showed last week, and we kind of talked about the final editing of the Hebrew Bible, but we talked about the sources, right? There's the J source and the E source, and so what the Bible is composed of these multiple different sources, or at least the 5 books. So I wanted to put on here a similar timeline. It's basically the same, but it kind of lays out when a lot of these sources, when scholars think a lot of these sources were maybe written. So the J source kind of goes all the way back to maybe the beginning of the monarchy with Saul and David, and stretches through to around when the northern kingdom was destroyed. And it's generally thought by scholars, because of the way the texts are put together and the stories that are in there, that it's more of a southern kingdom document than a northern kingdom. And then the other source is the E source, the Elohim source, which is more associated with the northern kingdom. And that seems to have pretty much stopped right at the northern kingdom destruction, which kind of makes sense, because so what you have is 2 kingdoms, north and south, and they each have their own traditions. Same basic religion, same basic God, same basic similar stories, but different, so they each have their own traditions. And then we talked about King Josiah and his big reforms. I think after the northern kingdom was destroyed, the southern kingdom, there was a group of priests, and they were kind of like, man, we got to get things straight here, because otherwise because they viewed the destruction of the northern kingdom as God's judgment on the northern kingdom for not worshiping properly. So that is basically the book of Deuteronomy and a lot of other stuff. And then the latest source is what's called the priestly source. And most scholars say that happened or came out of the exile and the post-exilic period, as the Jews were the Israelites were rebuilding their temple after after being released from exile. And so they kind of started writing and taking a lot of their plans for going forward and casting it back into the previous history to kind of say, this is how it should have been. This is the way it was from the beginning. We'll see some of that today.
With a really broad brush, how do they differ? I mean, what?
The J source is very much talks about God as anthropomorphic. So God walks in the garden in the cool of the evening. God breathes life into Adam. God comes down and comes to see Abraham in human form. Those seem to be kind of those kind of very old folk-tale-y stories where God is taking on human form, interacting. The E source is, they keep referring to God as Elohim, and they're often just different versions of a same story. So you end up with 2 stories, and again, we'll see some of that in our coming conversations, where there's 2 different stories kind of set together, and they're kind of the same, but not exactly. And so those are the 2 sources. The D source is kind of restating the law, that gets given to Moses, and it is very much retributional theology. If you do good things, God will bless you. If you do bad things, God's going to punish you. And so that's kind of that overall mindset. And then the P source is all about, not all they care about, but mostly what they care about is the law, the ritual, how things are supposed to function in the temple. And so their vision of God, when you see it, is a very organized, very orderly God. So in the very first chapter of Genesis, we talked about the very cosmic. In the beginning, the world was void, formless and without void, and the Spirit of God moved. And creation is very orderly and kind of follows a pattern. That's the P source. They're very much concerned with doing things right, keeping things straight, always kind of just all the ritual stuff.
Thank you.
Scott, which is the strongest source in the New Testament?
These two are very evident, P and D. You can clearly see when you're in Leviticus, if you've ever read Leviticus, and it's just like, and don't eat meat, or don't eat this, and don't boil the meat in the milk of the mother, and don't wear clothes with two different types of fabrics woven together, and just all this. And if your bull gets out and kills somebody, and then you have to do this, that's all priestly source. That's all the rules and the laws in the P stuff. D is very much concerned with, are you following God and worshiping God in the right way? So these two are very clear. These you see mostly in the early stories, Abraham, creation, Abraham, the flood, Jacob and Esau, those kind of stories. You see this generally by the end of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. You've kind of have moved out of these sources. You see little flashes of them every once in a while when you get to Samuel and Kings, but they're usually more early sources.
Do you see the P stuff as being sort of a natural outgrowth of human evolution? People become more controlling and
Yeah, absolutely. I think they viewed their growth as a people and their history, and everybody was kind of doing what they wanted and worshiping the way they wanted, and they all got destroyed by the Babylonians and the Assyrians. And so the P's kind of come back and say, you know what, that's not the way we're going to operate. We've got to be more organized. We've got to follow God the right way, yada, yada, yada. So, hey, Jane, good morning. So I definitely see it as kind of an outgrowth of, we got to get ourselves organized and do things the right way, because we're not going to survive.
is what Jesus was born into.
That the P source is all about temple practices and cultic practices in the temple, and that's the world that Jesus came in at the height of the Second Temple period. I think most scholars would say that the early temple, the first temple that gets destroyed by the Babylonians, it was the temple, but it didn't have all the rigidity and the rules and the laws like the Second Temple period did. They really kind of doubled down and said, we got to get our house in order. And, it's like if you go through a bankruptcy, right? If you're kind of living and you're not keeping track of your money and everybody's doing this, and then all of a sudden something terrible happens and you go bankrupt, when you come out of that, you're going to be, all right, we're going to watch every penny and we're going to save every receipt, and I'm going to balance my checkbook every single day. That makes sense. You don't want that to happen again. So,
Scott,
yes.
if my understanding was that you were not supposed to worship unless you went to Jerusalem in the temple. Is that correct? Is that the right idea?
So you weren't supposed to sacrifice.
Sacrifice.
So you could go and worship. So as the Israelites came out of the exile, a lot of them were like, you guys go on back. I'm happy here. I bought a house and my kids are in school and I don't need to stay. I'm just staying here in Babylon because, things are not that bad. But if you want to go back, go on back, So they started getting what's called the diaspora, all these Jews throughout the kingdoms, the Greek, and what followed the Babylonians were the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then eventually the Roman Empire. And so they're kind of like these communities all throughout. So they had to be able to study and worship and do all these things. So it wasn't a prohibition on worship, but it was a prohibition on sacrifice. And that was really, really, really important to the priestly clan, is having a clear understanding of how you sacrifice. It was an important part of their story. their worship. So, and we can talk about that in a couple of weeks. I actually had a class set up to talk kind of through, because everybody thinks of it differently, right? We all have these views of sacrifice and what it meant and what it didn't mean, and it can be very confusing. And you read all those rules, and it's like, this doesn't make any sense. I don't, So there are some who say that there's. So I'm very much of a opinion that the people, we wrote the story of the Bible. We have been interpreting and evolving in our interpretations of what God, trying to understand who God is, what God does, what God expects of us, what God doesn't expect of us. And for us, probably most of us in this room, a lot of those ideas are formed by Jesus, right? In the stories of Jesus, in our encounters with Jesus. So I'm not of the mindset that God gave us all these laws at the very beginning and then we have to somehow piece them together. I'm much more of a, this whole mindset kind of evolved as we went through in the development of that. So for the Israelites at the time when they were in the temple worship was critical. They had to have it. It was the integral part. And then the Romans come in, Israel rebels against the Roman Empire in 67 CE, and then in come the Romans, and they're like, enough of this silliness, and they wipe them out and they destroy the temple, and there's nothing left of it except the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall. We see that. That's the only part of the temple that remains as part of the foundation. And so everything else is gone. And so Jews, now they didn't have a temple in Jerusalem to worship anymore. So they had to recast their religion. And that was the genesis of rabbinic Judaism, where the rabbis and the teaching and the books, and that's where they started writing the Torah, or not the Torah, the Talmud, and all the interpretations of the Torah. And they changed from a sacrificial system to a learning, teaching system. It wasn't so much, and part of it was because they just couldn't do the sacrifices anymore, and now they could do sacrifices. They could go, well, they can't because there's the mosque on top of where the temple was, so that kind of creates a problem. So, but that's, yeah, it was just kind of critical. It was integral into their religion. Any other questions? This is a great discussion. The other thing I wanted to say is I said monogamy was a Roman thing, and I was half right. It was technically a Roman. It actually started with the Greeks, and then the Greeks influenced the Romans, so it was kind of a Greek/Roman thing, not a biblical thing. So if you go to the Bible and you read the Old Testament, everybody has a bazillion wives, and women are treated like property, and it's not that great. The Greeks and the Romans came in, and they were much more organized in their governments. I think the Jewish mode of government was a monarchy, a kingship, but a lot of people just could kind of do what they wanted. As they started moving towards these bigger and bigger empires, the Greeks and the Romans were like, we need a little more official system, and how do we know who, some important person dies, who does all their stuff go to, and who gets all the power and inheritance and all of that. So they came up with a monogamy as a way to force legally, this is your wife, you can't have 5 wives, these are your heirs, this is who gets stuff. It made it much more organized from a legal system. I do not want to suggest that they were virtuous because they all practiced a variety of extracurricular activities, so to speak. So it wasn't so much a virtue thing or a, hey, we need to be more moral or anything like that. It was strictly a legal affair. But this whole idea of within ancient Judaism of monogamy isn't there. It's kind of cast. It's going back and rereading certain passages and kind of squinting in them funny and saying, oh yeah, I can kind of see monogamy there. So just so you know. Interesting. All right, so today we want to talk about the Exodus. The Exodus is the greatest story, I think, in the entire Hebrew Bible. It is so fascinating and so nuanced, and it's a story that has resonated with people for thousands of years. Thousands of years. The Exodus, there's 5 books. In the first 5 books of the Bible, it's called the Pentateuch, which is a fancy word that means 5 scrolls. So when the Jews were writing down their story, the first 5 books of the Bible, it's all one long continuous story. But if you guys remember LP records, right? And you can only put so many songs on an LP. You can't, so that's why you had double albums and triple albums. That's what they did here. They said, we can't fit all of this on one giant scroll, so we have to break it up into 5 scrolls, but it's all one long continuous story. Yeah, one long continuous story. I'll save that I got a little tidbit, but it'll take us down a different road, and I don't want to go down that road yet. We'll come back to that. It's inspired many cultures, many theological and political movements. The Puritans looked to the Exodus story when they left Europe and came to America. They talked about building a new Jerusalem here in the United States. You hear that sometimes. Ronald Reagan kind of captured that kind of mindset with the city on the hill. Remember his famous speech where he talked about America is the city on the hill, the light. So they saw that. Abolitionists used it. The civil rights movement constantly went back to the Exodus story, coming out of being liberated from bondage and getting taken to a new land where things were set right. And recently, Latin America has gone through dramatic, in the church, the Christian church in Latin America has embraced what's called liberation theology. And they're seeing it as liberation from poverty, liberation from just having to constantly work, and never being able kind of to move into more of a democratic or more of a democratic form of government and more of a system of where they can share the wealth. So freedom, liberation, emancipation, justice, all of that is in. So it's a great story. So I'm going to try to give you the framework of the Exodus in 8 slides, and we'll see how well I can do. And there will be, so we start out in Exodus 1. So we finished at the last part of Genesis. Joseph and Jacob and all of his family moved to Egypt because there's a famine in the land, and they need to talk about, or they need to be able to be protected and live, and they just kind of live there. And so in Exodus, some time has gone by, and a Pharaoh comes up who doesn't remember who Joseph was, and he's like, dude, there's like all these Hebrews here in the land of Egypt, and they're like multiplying like rabbits. We got to do something about this because they're going to take over the country if we don't do something. Sound familiar? And so Israel, they put Israel into slavery, and they make them build their cities and stuff for them, and yet they still keep multiplying. And Pharaoh's like, what the heck? And so he orders all of his troops to go out and kill all of the Hebrew boys that he can find under a certain age, because it's like, we just got to get rid of some of these people. There's just too many of them. And so they go out and kill them. Well, that happens when Moses is a baby. So his mom famously puts him in a basket, floats him down the Nile River, and he comes up into the reeds near the palace where Pharaoh and Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses, adopts Moses, and Moses escapes the execution of all the children and grows up in the palace of Pharaoh right under his nose. Fast forward a few years, Moses sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He gets upset. He kills the Egyptian. Now he's a wanted man. And so he hightails it out of Egypt and heads out across the desert. And he ends up in Midian, where he meets this guy named Jethro. And he's a priest of Midian. and he marries his daughter, and he kind of gets adopted into their family, and he's a sheep herder, and one day he's out herding sheep on this mountain called Sinai, and also sometimes called Horeb, and he comes across this bush, and the bush is burning, but it's not getting burned up. And Moses is like, what the heck is going on here? And so he walks out, and Moses says, if you've seen the 10 Commandments, this is, of course, Prince of Egypt, which all your kids and grandkids would know. And we'll get to the real Moses in a minute, which is Charlton Heston. But if you remember Charlton Heston, it's like, God's like, take your shoes off. And so he takes the sandals off, and he bows down. And God says to him, he's like, I've got an important job for you. You need to go back to Egypt and free my people. And Moses is like, you know I'm wanted. You know they're going to kill me if I go back to Egypt. I don't think I'm going to go back to Egypt. And God's like, you got to go back to Egypt. And Moses is like, yeah, I don't really want to go back to Egypt. And God's like, no, you got to go back to Egypt. And Moses is like, who am I going to tell him sent me? And he goes, I'll tell you my name. My name is Yahweh, which means I am who I am. And Moses is like, what kind of name is that? I've never heard of that. And God says, you've heard all these names. I talked to all of your forefathers by different names, but all the time it was really me. So all these other names you've heard, Elohim, whatever, it's really me. And so Moses is like, well, that's great, but I can't go back because the Jewish leaders there, I'm not really a Jew. I grew up in Pharaoh's court. They're not going to believe me. And God says, listen, I can send you signs. Stick your hand in your coat. He sticks his hand in. He pulls it out. His hand's all withered and scaly and falling apart. And he said, now stick it back in again. And it sounds like a kind of a cheesy magic show, right? And he sticks it back in. He pulls it out. And his hand is whole. And Moses is like, well, that's really cool. So God said, great. So go back and free my people. And Moses says, I'm just not very good at talking. I'm not, standing up in front of crowds isn't really my thing. I don't want to do that. And then by this time, God's getting a little annoyed. He's like, fine. I'll send you your brother, Aaron. He can do the talking for you. And Moses is like, I have a brother named Aaron? Who's that? Where was he? I've never seen him before. And God's like, we'll take care of you. And so then Moses is like, okay, you make some good points, but yeah, I'm not going to go. And then the wrath of the Lord was kindled against Moses. And Moses is like, okay, sorry, I'll go. So he goes down, picks up his wife, his family, tells his father-in-law, yeah, I'm going to go visit some friends over in Egypt for a little bit. And then he heads off to Egypt. And everything seems to be great. And then they get out on the trail to Egypt, and they're camping out. And God comes and tries to kill Moses. It's like, what? And so maybe he's still upset over the whole mountain thing. And so the story in the Bible is God is trying to kill Moses, but his wife, Zipporah, is smart, and she figures out the problem is their son hasn't been circumcised. So she whips out her knife, circumcises her son, and takes the foreskin and presses it against Moses' leg, and she says, I am now a bridegroom of blood, which I think I saw in college, that movie with Night of the Living Dead and then Bridegroom of Blood, maybe. That is totally weird. But apparently it solved the problem. God quit trying to kill Moses, and they headed on down. They run into Aaron. Aaron's like, hey, Moses, my name's Aaron. I'm your brother. And they're like, oh, great, let's go. So they get to Egypt. There's our man, Charlton, the real Moses. And they get to Egypt. Moses goes to talk to the Pharaoh, and he said, hey, you got to let my people go. And it says the Lord. And Pharaoh's like, no, I'm not going to do that. So then Moses said, well, God's going to send plagues. And he sends 10 plagues, one at a time. And every time the plague comes, they go to see the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh's like, oh, you guys are killing me, get out. And then God says, not so fast, Pharaoh, and he hardens his heart. And then Pharaoh's like, nope, I changed my mind, you can't go. Which also sounds kind of like Democrats and Republicans these days in Congress. So you sit down and talk about a deal, and then it's like they all have an agreement, and then it's like, nope, changed my mind. So God's clearly making a point because he keeps hardening Pharaoh's heart. He's just going to make the pain and suffering last for a while and make them feel sorry, regret that they ever enslaved the Egyptians. So finally they get to the last plague, and God tells Moses, I'm going to kill all the firstborn, but I'm not going to kill the Jewish kids, but the way I can't tell them apart really well, so paint the blood on the door, do a sacrifice of the lamb, and be ready to go, because when this plague is over, we're leaving. So they paint the blood on the door. The angel of death comes and kills all the firstborn in Egypt. Pharaoh's like, get out, I don't want you here anymore. So they all get out and they all take off. 600, according to the Bible, 600,000 men, which when you add women and children, estimates are 2 to 2.5 million people, is according to the Bible. So they head out and they get, and they say, well, let's go. This is easy. We'll just run up the coast and go to the land of Canaan, no problem. And God's like, the Philistines are in the land of Canaan, so I'm not going to take them that way. I'm going to take them through the desert, because everything great happens in the desert, right? So they head into the desert and they get to the Red Sea, also called the Sea of Reeds. There's a little translation glitch there. And the people are like, we're never going to get across this water, and Pharaoh's coming. You led us into the wilderness to die, which is a common frame during the Exodus stories. That people always say that to Moses about every other chapter. It's like, you led us out into the wilderness to die. And so Moses gets up there and he parts the sea, and the Israelites all cross, and then the Pharaoh sends his chariots, and the waters come crashing down, and all of Pharaoh's army is completely destroyed. And this is all recounted in prose, and then they have a second story. Again, talked about sources. The second story, which we'll look at next week, is the Song of the Sea, which is considered by most scholars to be one of the oldest texts in the Hebrew Bible. So these concepts of Exodus go way, way, way back. They are very, very old. All right, so then they all go to Sinai, and or they're going to go to the Mount Sinai and check it all out, but they don't have any food. They have to go and fight all these other tribes. So apparently the Israelites, they took all their weapons, but they didn't bring any food with them, which wasn't really such good planning. So God says, I'm going to give you manna from heaven. Every day the manna came down and they could eat the manna. Moses hits his staff against a rock and the water comes out of the rock. Another famous story from the Exodus. They go to fight the Amalekites. And so they're doing the battle, but they keep losing. The Israelites keep losing, and Moses goes up on the hill overseeing the battle like the general. And when he raises his hands, they start winning. But you can see from the picture, Moses is kind of old, so it's like hard to keep your hands up. And as his arms start to fall down, the Israelites start losing again. So Aaron and this other guy come over and they raise his and they hold his arms up. So that way they can't lower his arms, and the Israelites prevail over the Amalekites. I didn't make this up, it's in the Bible. Everything I'm saying, as snarky as it is actually in the Bible. So if you want to go read it. So then the Israelites all come to Mount Sinai. There's thunder and lightning, and where God is on the mountain up at the top. And Moses has to go up the mountain, and he comes down the mountain, and he goes up the mountain, and he goes down the mountain. And if you read this section of the Bible, it's like, how many times are you going to go up and down? And he goes up, and then he comes down, and he goes up, and then he comes down. So it's a lot of up and down the mountain. Part of the fitness plan, I guess, for Moses. And this one, if you guys don't recognize this one, this is the scene from Mel Brooks' The History of the World, where Moses comes down with 3 tablets, and he's like, the Lord God has given us these 15, and then he drops one of the tablets, and it shatters at his feet, and he goes, these 10 commandments have given to us by the Lord. Great scene. So he gives them the 10 commandments, he gives them the book of the covenant, he gives them detailed blueprints of how to build the tabernacle, which looks just like the I mean, there's chapter and chapter and chapter and chapter on how to build the tabernacle and all the stuff you got to put into it. So clearly, this is a priestly source. God is very worried about how you're going to worship. Even though you're just roaming around in the desert, it's important to have a tabernacle right away. And then right in the middle of that, God's like, hey, Moses, have you checked in on your people lately? And Moses is like, no, my phone was turned off. I haven't got any text. So he goes down, and meanwhile, while Moses is up there, the people are like, they go to Aaron, and they're like, Aaron, what happened to this Moses guy? We don't even know who this guy is. He just showed up one day, and he's been up on this mountain for like ever, and we're never going to see him again. And he goes, we need a God, just like everybody else has. And so Aaron says, okay, bring me all your stuff. He doesn't even argue. He's like, bring me all your gold, bring me all your stuff. They melt it all down. They make an idol. They brought all their gold with them. So, yeah, no food, but lots of gold. And they melt it down, and they make this idol, and they start worshiping it. And Moses comes down, and he's like, what the hell is going on down here, people? And he goes to Aaron. He's like, what? You're in charge? What happened? And Aaron, this is all true. This is all in the Bible. Aaron's like, I didn't. They just brought all their gold, and I threw it in the fire, and out pops this golden calf. I don't know what happened. So Moses is like, this is bad. He crushes all the commandments. He says, this is terrible. You guys are wrong. God is angry. God's like, people have to die for this. And God's like, Moses is like, who did I kill? And God says, I don't care. Just somebody's got to die. So Moses rounds up the Levites, and he sends them around through, and they just start randomly stabbing people until 3,000 people are dead. And then God says, okay, that's enough. I'm happy now. And Moses goes back up to the mountain and gets the rest of the covenant. Weird story, right in the middle of all this stuff. Then we get to Leviticus. And if you've ever read the book of Leviticus, I'm so sorry for you. It is a long, boring book. You should just every once in a while, don't read the whole thing, but flip through some of this, because there's laws on everything. Laws on how to ordain the priests, how to do sacrifices, purity laws, discussion of what you do on the Day of Atonement, a whole thing about, there's laws in there about when you're, like I said earlier, when your animals get out and if they go and trample somebody else's garden, how much you have to pay them. Very, very similar to the laws and rules of other ancient societies. People often point to the Code of Hammurabi, which is a Hittite code. Remember, the Hittites were the empire to the north, and they had a code almost identical to this that had all of these specific rules on what you do. So you go through all the rules. So God gives them, this whole time they're at Mount Sinai, gives them all these rules. And then we get to the book of Numbers, and it's like, okay, we're through all the rules. The people are still out in the desert. So Moses says, you know what, we need to take a census, see how many people we have here. They celebrate Passover. They get ready to leave the Sinai, and they get out into the desert, heading towards the promised land. And Moses says, you know what, we need to scope out this land. Nobody's actually ever been there before. So we need to see what's going on. So he sends 12 spies, one spy from each tribe, and they sends them into the land to check it out, and they're gone for, I can't remember how long, a couple months, 40 days, probably 40 days. Everything happens in 40 days in the Bible. So probably 40 days, don't quote me on that, and they come back and they're like, this land is amazing, but there are giants, and they're big, and they're the Nephilim. You remember those guys from a couple of weeks ago? And we're like grasshoppers compared to them, and they've got big weapons, and they've got all of these fortified cities, and they're going to obliterate us. We shouldn't go. And the people are like, why did you bring us out of Egypt? We had it so good, and now we're... And Moses is like, you guys drive me crazy. And God is like, you guys drive me crazy too. And he goes, I want to kill you every time I turn around. You're a stiff-necked people, and if you don't stop, I'm just going to destroy you all here. And Moses has to say, no, don't kill them. What would the people say? What would the Egyptians say? You brought us out of Egypt only to kill your people in the middle of the desert. That would be terrible. Bad PR. Not a good way to do it. So as a punishment for the people's lack of faith, they have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. So they can't go into the land. They have to wander around in the wilderness. They get to another place. They have to get water out of a rock again, which is kind of weird. It's like, didn't we do this already? It's like a kind of a recurring theme. Numbers 21, you get to the people and they're like, I don't know, they did something wrong. The people of Israel are always doing something wrong. And so God gets upset and he sends all these poisonous snakes. So you get this picture here. After a while, the children of Israel screw up. God gets mad. He punishes them. And then he says, okay, well, I'll have some mercy and I'll save you. But God's the one who's getting mad. God's the one who's doing the punishing. And then God's the one who's providing the salvation. Common theme that we're going to start seeing. So everybody's getting bit by the poisonous snakes, and they're all like, we're dying. What is going on here? And so God tells Moses, make a bronze serpent, wrap it around a staff, hold it up. Anybody who looks up at the bronze serpent will be saved. And if they don't look, then they're going to die. And it's like, okay, that's weird. So he makes a bronze serpent, and he holds it up, and most of the people live, which is why, if you've in the medical field or know anything, snakes are on the medical insignia because of this and other cultures where snakes were kind of regarded as magical creatures with healing properties. Go figure.
When do you think that was adopted?
The medical insignia? Boy, I don't know. Any doctors in the room or nurses? I don't know. I just see them all the time. I remember the first time I actually paid attention, I asked them, why does that guy have snakes? Because I'm like Indiana Jones. If you've seen Indiana Jones, snakes, anything but snakes is like, I can't deal with snakes. So yeah, I don't know. As long as it's been quite a while. And the idea of snakes as healing agents goes back to 2,000 years before Christ. I mean, it's a very, very old concept. When it got adopted as the medical insignia, I don't know.
At any point during the Old Testament, does it ever say that one of these days God's not going to come down and kill everybody?
Yeah, when we get to Jesus. I don't know. You start seeing a softening of this. These Old Testament stories, these early ones, are very brutal. Yeah. This is why I've said it before, you don't let your kids read the Bible. It's kind of, let them read about Jesus, healing people. And so finally, in Numbers, they get ready to go into the land, and they're all set. The 40 years has passed. And then Moses says, all right, before you go, let me tell you one more time. Britney Spears fans? Oops, I did it again. All right. So that took me a long time on ChatGPT to come up with this picture. Moses says, before you go, one last thought, and he recounts the entire law. And he goes through all the stuff that Leviticus just went through, and he goes through it again. Only this time, things are different. Some stuff's the same, but other stuff is different, which leads to, if you've ever met some traditional Jewish folks, they can tie themselves into knots trying to collate the different laws together, because some of the laws in Deuteronomy are completely different and go backwards or go completely opposite to what the laws in Leviticus say. So it's a different set. Again, Deuteronomy is most likely that book of the law. Most scholars think Deuteronomy was the first law that was written down at the time of Josiah, and that the Leviticus, the priestly laws, were written down after that, and they were versions of that. And they took some of these laws and they said, this isn't really working anymore for us, so they tweaked them and they revised them. And then they all got mushed together into the Pentateuch. So anyway, they revisit all the laws. Moses appoints Joshua and says, go into the land. Moses dies and gets buried on somewhere outside the land. And for those of you who don't know, or if you've ever heard that Moses is the one who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, anybody ever hear that? Oh, well, there's a tradition, kind of historical tradition, that Moses was the author of the first 5 books of the Bible. But in the book, it says Moses died and he got buried, and this is the quote from the Bible, and no one knows where his grave is, even to this day. So it's clearly not a book that was written recently. It's a book that was recent to Moses. It's much later. Because if it was written around the time of Moses, they'd say, Moses died and we buried him up on the hill right over here. And everybody knows that. Okay, so that was a long, but that's the entire first 5 books of the Bible. No problem. So let's talk a little bit about, this is a class on history and archaeology. What historical data do we have to support this? And the answer is none. There is zero data out there. So let me go through a little bit of the lack of data and why there's not a lot of data to support this. There's no archaeological or historical records of a mass exodus of people from Egypt. The Egyptians were they documented everything, especially at the time. This dynasty that ruled, it was the peak of Egyptian power in the ancient Near East. And they had outposts throughout the land, and they were keeping meticulous records. No evidence of any of that. People say, well, if your army got defeated and decimated by a bunch of slaves, why would you want to write that down? But news doesn't travel fast, and if they wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years, 2.5 million people would have left a trace. There's no evidence anywhere of anything even close to that kind of movement of people. The timelines in the Bible don't align with each other. And there are a lot of anachronistic aspects in the story, which means there's things in the story that kind of don't make sense at the time that this would have occurred. They make sense later, but they don't make sense at the time of the story. So let's take a look at a couple of these. Now, there is a long history of Semitic people going back and forth from Egypt, from Canaan and from the surrounding areas into Egypt. Egyptian records have names of Semitic people, slaves. When they list out who all built it, there's Semitic names that are there. So the idea of Semitic people in Egypt is not a foreign idea. That is truly rooted in history, because, let me see if I can't remember what my next slide is. Oh yeah. Here in Egypt, the climate and the economy of Egypt is driven by the Nile River, which means way down here in Africa, the river flows north from the sources in Africa. The Nile is being driven by a completely different climate than the rest of the area on the ancient Near East, which means that in times of drought and famine in this area, Egypt generally had water, and they were kind of immune from famine because everything was dependent for them on the Nile. Now, they certainly had famines. I'm not saying that they never had that, but it was much less severe and much less frequent than other places. So every time there's famine and there's no food and you're in an agrarian society, you start looking for where you can eat, and that's generally Egypt. So there usually was a lot of people coming in and out of Egypt, especially in times of famine. That's well documented in the history. Here's a painting, tomb painting from ancient Egypt that dates to almost 2,000 years before Christ. And you can see these Semitic people all traveling in. These are the Egyptians down here. These are all the Semitic people of the land of Canaan who are all kind of traveling in, bringing and offering their sacrifices and coming into the land. So definitely documentation of that. There was a period of time in Egypt, and you may hear this name if you read various history texts, called the Hyksos. And the Hyksos actually ruled, that's an Egyptian word that means rulers from a foreign land. And they were a West Semitic people, and they came in and they kind of took control. They had been living in Egypt for a while, maybe came in during a famine, and they took control of Egypt, and they ran Egypt, and they were the pharaohs and subjugated. So it was kind of like they usurped the normal line of authority, hostile takeover, took over the country. And eventually they ruled for about 100 years, from 1650 to 1550 BCE. But they were eventually driven out by the Egyptians. They overthrew this dynasty and drove them out. Modern excavations have found Canaanite-style houses, Canaanite-style pottery in the capital of the Hyksos. So there's some thought that maybe this may have served as kind of a template, that people knew this was going on, that maybe helped serve as a template for the Exodus story. A little closer to when the Exodus probably occurred, there are the Amarna letters, and these are clay tablets written in not hieroglyphs but cuneiform, and they were from outposts throughout the Egyptian Empire. So you remember the map, and the Egyptians kind of controlled all of Israel. They were at the peak of their power. These were being sent in by diplomats to the Pharaoh, kind of reporting on status of, hey, here's what's going on. And these correspondences occasionally mention groups called Habaru or Aparu, and they seem to be, from the descriptions, a semi-nomadic people who are living in the land of Canaan. And they talk about migrants coming in and out of Egypt or in and out of Egyptian territory. And they refer to them again as the Habaru. Some scholars have think that maybe that was the origin of the word Hebrew. There's the word Hebrew, the etymology for that term is not really strong. Nobody seems to really know where that word came from. So maybe this is something. There's other scholars who say, no, that's ridiculous. That's not the case. But regardless, you see these semi-nomadic people living in the land of Canaan, coming in and out of Egyptian territory, all about the time that the Exodus may have occurred. So there's two clues. There's a couple of clues in the Bible about when, or in the Exodus story, as to when this could happen. So in Exodus 1, it said the Egyptians set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. Okay, and we know now where those cities are, and they've been excavated. And then, when the Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, even though that was the easier route, but he took them through the desert. So, if we kind of look at that, here's Ramses, the city of Ramses is kind of right here in the Nile Delta. So you can kind of see that it's like, hey, if you want to get to Jerusalem, you just scooch right along the coast, and it's not a bad thing. Here's the land of Midian. This is where it says Moses went when he left Egypt, and he ran into his father-in-law. So Sinai, this is the Sinai Peninsula. Mount Sinai is famously located here, and there's a church on the top of the mountain there where Moses got the law, but most scholars don't think that they would have come all the way down through there, and that the term, there was a mistranslation when the Hebrew text went from Hebrew to Greek. So there was a big translation 200 or 300 years before Christ was born, where they translated it into Greek because that was the language of the time. And the Hebrew text says they crossed the Sea of Reeds. Nobody's really sure where the Sea of Reeds are, but it got translated Red Sea. So it's kind of like, was it the Red Sea? Was it the Sea of Reeds? This is what we think of as the Red Sea. This would be a major waterway to cross miraculously. A Sea of Reeds makes me think more marshy. That kind of makes a little more sense that things got dried up. But regardless, and then in Kings, when Solomon's getting ready to build the temple, they say, it says, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of the land, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, he began to build the house of the Lord. So most scholars generally agree that when Solomon was reigning, so it would place the Exodus somewhere around 1450 BCE. So there's an early date. That's the earliest date, 1450 BCE. But the problem is that's way too early to be building the cities of Ramses, because they didn't start construction on that till 1250, 1200 BCE. So it's like, and most people think anytime the Bible uses big round numbers, it's generally kind of synonymous with this is a really long time. A really long time took place before. So you could read that not as 480 years from when the Israelites came out of the land, but a long time after we came out of the land, Solomon began to build the temple. If you go with a later date, which is somewhere around 1250, that coincides with Ramses. So here's the early date, far too early. Ramses II, who most scholars think is probably the pharaoh that is being referenced, even though they're never called out, he ruled in this time frame. So, and this is about the time Ramses, Pi Ramses was being built. So if they came out around 1250, and then remember we have the first recorded instance where they talk about the word Israel is mentioned is by Ramses' son Merneptah, who went in and said he destroyed the Israelites. That was in 1208. So the timeline kind of fits, even though Merneptah didn't really think of them as a people group. So that kind of fits, but the problem is Philistines didn't show up until beyond 1200 to 1100. That's when the Philistines, or the sea people, started coming in from Greece and from Phoenicia and settling along the western coast of the Mediterranean. So as you can see, it's hard to be able, if you wanted to say, when historically would this have occurred? Hard to put a date to it. Things don't seem to match up very well. How am I doing on time? Is it late? It's getting a little late. All right, so we'll just stop for there and we'll finish this up next week. The quick answer is that I think, or the takeaway is, this is a great story, and it's probably exactly that. It's a great story. It maybe have little things that are rooted in history. We'll talk more about that next week, and then we'll go back and look at some of the details of it. I think you don't, back to one of the first classes, you don't have to have an actual historical event for it to be real and meaningful to us in our minds. So, and I think that's what this is. This gave them, especially I think in light of the Babylonian exile, the idea of an earlier time when they escaped from captivity. Clearly some of the texts about escaping from Egypt predate the Babylonian exile, but they certainly would have gotten been a lot more meaningful after you live through that exile. So we'll talk about a little more of that next week. So thanks for coming. Have a great week. I will see you all next week.